I first want to just introduce myself, Michael Sapienza. I'm the CEO of the Colon Cancer Alliance. What we're going to be talking about today, which both is value, cost of care, the challenges, and let's also say opportunities, I think, to access for patients. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our three panelists. We have Randy Burkholder, Vice President of Policy and Research at PhRMA, Emily Pomeranz, GI cancer patient. She's my far left, and then Dana Wollins, the Senior Director at ASCO. So maybe, Randy, you can just briefly introduce yourself and what your role is at PhRMA.
Thank you, Michael. I'm delighted to be here this morning, and especially on a panel with you and with an actual patient. I think any of us who have either gone through the diagnosis of cancer directly or through a close family member can begin to appreciate the clarifying effect that can have, and I think it can have the same effect on a panel, so I appreciate you having a patient here as well. As Michael said, I am a Vice President in the Policy and Research Department at Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. I work on a wide range of issues there related to coverage and payment policy, evidence standards, and decision support tools. That includes currently issues such as Medicare Part B and Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation policy and proposals, evidence standards in coverage and payment, and some of the emerging value assessment frameworks and decision support tools like the one that ASCO has made a lot of progress in developing. So I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. Dana?
Good morning. A pleasure to be here this morning. I appreciate the invitation and look forward to our discussion today. My name is Dana Wollins. I'm Senior Director of Health Policy at the American Society of Clinical Oncology, ASCO. ASCO is the largest, it's now really an international organization dedicated to curing cancer. We represent more than 40,000 providers who do the work every day to do that. And my role at ASCO is I'm the director of our health policy division. One of the reasons that I am here with you today is we've been focusing very much on the cost and value issues related to cancer care, and a lot of my days are spent on that topic. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the work that ASCO is doing in that regard today.
Great, Dana, thank you. And Emily?
Hi, I'm Emily Pomeranz, and I am a current GI cancer patient at Georgetown University, and I believe I'll be telling my story a little bit later.
I would love to hear actually your story now. I think it's good to put it into context at the beginning if we can.
Oh, really? Start
yes.
with me? Okay.
Thank you, Emily.
Really? All right. Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to say I'm a very lucky person. I'm unlucky because I've had cancer 3 times. But I'm very lucky because it was either caught early or I was in a trial and benefited from the advancements of cancer treatment. When I was 20 years old, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, but it was caught early and I was treated with radiation. But it was in the 80s, and back then they probably gave me about twice the amount of radiation that they would give me if I was diagnosed with it today. So fast forward 20 years later, when I was 40, I was diagnosed with breast cancer secondary to the radiation from my Hodgkin's disease. But again, it was caught early, and I was surgically treated. And at that point, I thought, well, I'm done with cancer for a while. That should be good twice in, between 20 and 40. But then in 2014, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 4. And that was just devastating. I just couldn't believe that I was diagnosed with cancer again, and to be diagnosed at stage 4, after having it caught, my idea of cancer is it's caught early and you're treated and you go on. So it was devastating for me. But I was lucky enough to land at Georgetown, and my oncologist, Dr. Michael PhRMA, my hero. And he put me on a clinical trial for a PARP inhibitor, but I was not a good patient at this point. I kind of had no fight in me, and I didn't feel like I was just sort of done. And, I had Googled pancreatic cancer, stage 4, and I know you're not supposed to, but I did. And it just seemed like it was a death sentence. So I actually stopped after 5 treatments and checked myself into a hospice, prepared to die, and said goodbye to my friends and family. But 5 months later, I was still alive. So we took a CT scan to see what was going on, and it turns out all my tumors were gone. I had had tumors in my pancreas, liver, and 2 spots in my lungs, and they were all gone. And that was shocking to me. I didn't even think that was a possibility that you could be in a quote-unquote remission from pancreatic cancer stage 4. So it took a while for it to sink in. But then once it did, it was a great feeling. You really go from being hopeless, which is what I felt, to being hopeful. So I was good and in remission for a while, but in April of this year, the cancer reappeared in my peritoneum. So we tried the PARP inhibitor again, but it didn't work. So now I'm on immunotherapy. I'm taking Keytruda, the Jimmy Carter drug that everybody's probably heard of now in immunotherapy. And I've only been on it a couple months, but I feel great. I'm very hopeful. We have a CT scan on Monday, and I really think I'm headed towards another remission. They had done an initial CT scan early on, and it already showed my tumors were shrinking. And I just am so grateful to be here and to tell my story, and that you can go from what I thought was a very hopeless situation to hope. And I'm enjoying every day and enjoying my friends and family, and I'm just glad to be here to share my story.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. I also want to thank John, and I want to thank Dr. Fishbane, et cetera, for the hard work that they're doing. Obviously, these trials are making an impact, and I know we'll be talking a little bit more about that as we go on. So yesterday, I was talking on the phone with Emily, and I asked her, I said, well, what do you think about the cost of care and value? And it was interesting, her response. Maybe you can just touch on it just a moment, what you kind of first said, because I do think it's important.
Well, I said that I'm very lucky. I haven't had to deal with too many problems with cost. I had worked for the federal government for 17 years, and I have Blue Cross Blue Shield FEP, which is a very good insurance card to have. And I get bills I get bills. But most of my costs have been covered. I really haven't had to deal, and I know I'm so lucky, and I'm in the minority. You read, the thought that I couldn't get a treatment just based on financial reasons. If that was the only reason I couldn't get it, it would just be devastating, because you're already devastated with the diagnosis, and you're in a very vulnerable, scary place.
So Randy, this may be a good segue to kind of talk about value and the value framework that you guys are working on at PhRMA. So I think sometimes there's confusion in layperson speak about what really value means for a patient. So maybe we can touch on that, but then also what you guys are working on at PhRMA.
Sure. And if I haven't been on a ton of panels. I've been on enough to know I'm not going to presume to say what value means for a
sure,
patient.
absolutely.
But that said, I would say, and I would say we really take to heart that, two things, that we do need to be focused on the patient, and that reforms that actually help us drive and even accelerate the drive to value in healthcare are an important part of meeting the challenges we face and sustaining the kind of incredible progress we already heard about this morning, but also sustaining our healthcare financing and affordability for patients. So that's number one. We think by focusing on value and doing it right and getting the details right, and it's really important to get the details right, that we can do so in ways that center on and are responsive to the needs of the individual patient, which is, I'm sure all of you know better than I do, are highly variable and continually changing in the oncology space. I would say the other, and you're going to have to get me back to actually answer your question in a minute here, but we also take very seriously the idea that no patient should have to worry about the issue of affordability of their treatment when they are faced with a diagnosis like cancer. We also recognize those challenges around affordability and value are multifaceted. We need to be looking at the value of all components of care, including treatments, and ensuring that there is accountability to value across that entire system of care. That's something we take seriously and can talk more about some of the work we're doing in that space. But also, if there are patients who are facing a particular challenge or gap in affordability, making sure that there are resources in place, whether it's patient assistance foundations or whatnot, so that those patients don't need to worry about that when they face that kind of a diagnosis. And while we recognize there's accountability for every component in healthcare, including medicines, as I think Emily illustrated, part of that is an issue not just of the input cost, but of the adequacy of insurance, and we need to look at that holistically as well.
So what are your thoughts? We didn't really talk about this ahead of time, so don't shoot me. But you did bring up Part B. So I'm just wondering if we could maybe go into a little bit in terms of access via Part B and Part D. So being a patient advocate myself, I've heard from a lot of pharmaceutical companies that they're finding that the financial assistance isn't there especially for some of the oral oncolytics. So is there anything as part of Part B or Part D that you think, maybe just talk maybe a little bit about it from a layperson standpoint, how access is maybe hindered, or are there opportunities down the road for basically Part B?
Yeah, so I think one of the big opportunities is in looking at some of the novel payment and delivery arrangements that are out there, and through an organization like the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. One of the things they're looking at in the Medicare Advantage space, for example, is value-based insurance design and do co-pays and utilization management tools. Are they aligned with demonstrated value in the way they can and should be? That's just one part of it. That's not the full answer, but I think that's one of the steps we can take. I would. I won't digress on Part B.
Yeah,
to it, but.
I think for us too, one of the big issues is copay assistance. We get lots and lots and lots of phone calls for people that need copay assistance that are on Medicare, especially for some of these oral oncolytics. And I know this may be for a different day, the Part D discussion, or if you have any thoughts around that. I know right now the formula as Part D is a little bit different for oral oncolytics versus the infused drugs. So do you have any thoughts around that, or are you aware, or Dana, I don't know if you were aware of either one of these as well, if you want to touch on it as well, Part D.
So the affordability of drugs, when you look at the co-payments, is actually one of the most concerning pieces, because from a standpoint of Medicare, for example, where you would not be protected with any cap, say that you would have in the health insurance exchanges under the Affordable Care Act, you would actually have to pay 20% of whatever your drug costs are. So, if your drug costs are $200, that may be fine. If they're $200,000, they're not necessarily fine. And that's where people are mortgaging their homes 2 times over, their savings are being wiped out, and they're really very concerned about the burdens they're leaving for their families. So one of the things that ASCO's really tried to promote is looking at ways to create the better mechanisms, particularly for oral chemotherapy, where you're not penalized as a patient to go on oral versus IV. And that's something called oral parity. And that's one of the most important things we think about when we think of equalizing the playing field for the patient, because oftentimes oral therapies are a lot easier to go and get. You don't have to come in and sit in the infusion room. So that's one of the things that we've been very concerned about. And we can get into the Part B and the Medicare demonstration for Part B. I think the big, point with all that, without getting into all the details, I don't know if there's time for that, is that, as Randy said, the good news is that more and more from a national level now with MACRA, which is the new way that physicians and healthcare providers are going to be paid in our country for the work they do, they're going to be looking at things in a very different way. And it's around value versus just fee for service, in other words, or volume. So when we talk about how clinicians get paid today, you do your service and you get reimbursed. And the whole way that's going to change is really actually going to infuse a real influence on how you think about providing the biggest, what I like to, and I'll say this again probably in a moment in terms of a defining value, really making sure you get the best outcome for the dollar spent. And so really, we really want to look at payment reform in that context as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here when we look at the way drugs are covered and reimbursed, but truly the cost of them themselves is an issue that we need to confront.
Randy, did you want to touch on anything else there? Or you?
I want to give Emily a chance.
Okay.
So I think we.
Great. So in terms of going back to the value just for a second, you know, Randy, I brought this question up beforehand. So I think we probably could do a better job about communicating to the public, you know, just in general about the cost of care. You know, what are your thoughts about being able to communicate that, you know, the costs for R&D, you know, are worth it, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think that would be the starting point, is that we can do a better job, certainly, and we're hoping to do a better job in the coming year of conveying what we just heard. And I think what is probably more familiar to most of the people in this room, but it maybe is less awareness for a lot of people outside of this room, which is just the really, really significant strides we have made against a lot of forms of cancer in terms of declines in death rate and improving 5-year survival over the last several decades. But probably more importantly, the cusp of the really potentially, well, some of the game-changing treatments we are already seeing in some cancers, but the potential for treatments like those in the immunotherapy or CAR T space to really have dramatic change over the next 5 years. So I think that that is job number one, is just making sure we are doing a good job communicating that we're on the cusp of some really phenomenal opportunities. I think the other thing we need to do is to make sure, and I think some of that excitement is increasingly reflected amongst policymakers here in Washington when you look at initiatives like the President's Moonshot Initiative, the Precision Medicine Initiative, 21st Century Cures legislation, to say that we need to be working to it, ensure that our discovery and development, the regulatory science and clinical trials are aligned and can actually accelerate that. I think the other thing that will be critically important for us to communicate is that, we can figure this out in terms of value, that, you know, we face these same challenges in mental health in the 1980s. We faced the same challenges with HIV/AIDS in the 1990s. We faced the same issues with hepatitis C a few years ago. And we see that we innovated our way through those, and I share the belief that a number of leading cancer researchers and thought leaders articulated in an article a few years ago where they said, we think we can do the same thing in cancer in the coming decade, where scientific progress transform patient care, and through innovation, not only in the science but in clinical practice, we averted a predicted health spending crisis. So I think the other thing we need to communicate is that we have opportunity. Yes, we have challenges, but we have the ability to meet those challenges. And again, I think getting value-driven healthcare right is an important part of that answer.
That's great. So Dana, can you maybe talk a little bit about the ASCO value framework?
Sure, I'm happy to. And just to step back for a moment, a little bit of the context around it, you know, this notion of, we were talking about the affordability and the copay issue and the 20% if you're a Medicare patient. And what's really interesting is we think it's bad now, and I don't mean to be negative, but if things don't change, right? So there are projections from pretty trusted sources that say by the year 2021, the average household income, 50% of that income will go to out-of-pocket costs and copays and premiums, excuse me. That's not going to be sustainable. Mm-hmm. So we have a situation here. And one of the things ASCO's tried to think about a lot, and this started over a decade ago, when we started to understand that the treatments that oncologists were giving to their patients were causing not only side effects that were physically difficult, but they were causing financial toxicity as well. And this is a term now that's entered the vernacular. You may have heard the term. The idea behind it, and it's because it's been seen now around us so much, is that as a patient thinks about their diagnosis, and as Emily said, is confronted with all of the issues from a medical perspective and the social issues and the employment issues, they're also now confronted with price tag issues. And fortunately, there's copay assistance and importantly, free drug help. But that kind of help, we have been concerned is really a Band-Aid for a larger systemic issue in our country that we need to address. Because at the end of the day, we know that patients who need these drugs really, we believe, should be able to have them. ASCO started to think about this issue over 10 years ago in the context of cost and set up a task force called our Cost of Care Task Force. And we were really the sort of leading experts. Nancy Davidson, one of our ASCO presidents, who was president at the time, really said, let's get together and just start to think of what can the oncology provider community do about this issue for our patients. We're starting to get uncomfortable because we're not talking about it. Patients are coming into the clinic, they look at us, they ask us their opinion. There's a tremendous issue with power differential because you're sitting there as the clinician and whatever you say, the patient's in a very vulnerable position and they're gonna hear you and not necessarily question or ask. And that is not a situation or recipe for very good open communication. And you couple that with really a historically cultural way people, I think, who are in medicine have always thought of their role as do no harm and don't bring up cost. Well, do no harm doesn't necessarily equal not bringing up cost anymore. In fact, doing no harm could mean bringing it up so that the patient has a full breadth of information to be drawing from when they make decisions. Now, in some cases, cost hopefully shouldn't make a difference and should not make a difference if there's a clinically superior option for people. But one thing the task force on cost at ASCO started to think about is, well, if there are options for a patient, do we even understand the relative value of those options to talk to patients about them? And it was very difficult for oncologists to be able to do that because there was no language for this. So we set about trying to first introduce that it was okay to talk about cost. And that was hard. But once we opened up the dialogue and started to write about the issue and get leading oncologists to say it's okay, it started a dialogue. And now you'll see at our ASCO annual meetings, there are dialogues now with many education sessions and scientific abstracts that are presented. People are debating this issue. And not because it shouldn't be offered, but because there should be greater transparency and understanding of what you get for what you spend. And I think that's really where we all can come together, because I like to think about what Lowell Schnipper, our task force, it's now called our value task force because it's more than just cost, talks about. And he says, if you go into a Buick dealership and you see the Buick and you want to pay Buick prices. Yeah. You go into a Mercedes dealership and you want to pay Mercedes prices. You know what you're going to get, generally. Not 100%, but you have a feel because it's sort of known. We want to be able to equip patients with that kind of understanding too, and same with the doctors involved, so that there can be a greater relationship too between the value of a given therapy. We believe the first step is to make it a little bit more understood what that looks like. ASCO's value framework is an attempt to do that. What we've tried to do is look at what doctors do in their head anyway when they're trying to talk with patients. As we understand, there has to be a lot of information they're putting together for that individual in front of them. It's not just what the clinical trial data showed in that particular publication. It's got to be the clinical data that they know and know very well as experienced practitioners. But they have to look at it in the context of that patient. What comorbidities do they have? What kind of, how old is this patient? The average clinical trial participant does not match the average patient coming into the clinic. And they need to assemble that information and give a good recommendation and a good kind of set of information for shared decision making. And what had been missing for a lot of this time is a way to kind of assess that information in a way that's easy to do and that also allows the cost conversation to come in. The value framework is a way that allows anybody who wishes to take two different options and look at them from a clinical perspective. So what do they offer each other in terms of their benefit from a clinical perspective, their side effects versus their efficacy, their overall survival, things you see in the data. How do you put that together the way a doctor would in their head? We call that our net health benefit. The net health benefit is what kind of increased benefit or added benefit might you get over one treatment than the other if you look at them side by side. And that gives you a net health benefit. We're not the first to coin a net health benefit. In fact, we're now not the only group out there doing value frameworks. The good news is, since this time, a lot of folks are thinking about what is the value equation we need for people. Well, value is a very personal thing. So a couple things. One is if you have a net health benefit, that's still just something on a piece of paper. So what's very important to the ASCO tool is that it's personalizable. So if toxicity matters more, if longevity matters more, you can weight those things and you can change the way a net health benefit score would be for you. The other important feature for the value framework in ASCO's value framework is that we don't integrate cost to create a more or less valuable treatment. We simply show the cost because we believe a patient is going to, and we've heard this and learned by many, many stakeholder meetings with a full swath of stakeholders, most importantly patients, that they want to understand what clinically something's going to mean. And they may want to consider cost, but they want the two looked at separately so that they can bring them together if they wish. And that's a really important thing. I'll conclude by saying one of the things we tried to do in developing the value framework is to look at a way to put our toe in the water and begin to do this. There are many limitations today for doing a value framework. I mentioned how individualized value is. And the fact of the matter is we don't have good data on a lot of the things that patients want to know in terms of how something's going to affect them. A lot of the wonderful numbers that we heard earlier in terms of the many more patients surviving cancer today, that's only good news. That also means, though, there are 15 million cancer survivors living today, many of whom are living with very significant long-term effects of their treatment that are causing risk for second malignancies and many other quality of life issues. We've heard time and time again that to really get a good value equation, we need to take into consideration not only how well this treatment, knock on wood, is going to do to cure the cancer, but how it's going to leave me when it's done doing its first job.
So, quick question. I mean, two pieces. So, just for those of you that don't know, in my previous life, I was a trumpet player. I was a professional musician, and I used to play the trumpet. And I thought about this. If I was unlucky and got diagnosed, let's say, with colorectal cancer, I would have
Peripheral
neuropathy and cracking on my hands, et cetera, probably sores on my mouth, et cetera. So playing the trumpet would be a real, would be very hard in terms of my actual employment, making money, et cetera. So do you think that the ASCO framework takes those sorts of things? You touched on it a little bit, but do you think it takes those things into account?
It's such a good example. We use the piano player example, but I'm going to use trumpet from now on.
Sure.
The idea here is that absolutely it has to take those things into consideration. And the fact is peripheral neuropathy, while it may not be considered, toxicity can be in grades, and the highest grade toxicity, which is reported in clinical trials, is going to be up to, grade 5 would be death. So we're not talking about that, but it's surely a quality of life issue, and we would call that more of a lower grade toxicity in many cases. Well, our initial iteration, it's great you brought it up because this is where it has to be a collective definition of value to make a good value framework. We didn't have low-grade toxicity in there. And the reason why was a practical reason, frankly. We didn't see it being reported regularly in clinical trials, and it was very difficult to then capture and use in an algorithm like our framework. So we didn't have it in as our first draft. When we sent it out for public comment, and by the way, we got over 400 responses to our request for public comment from individuals, from organizations. It was fantastic. One of the big pieces of feedback we got was you got to include low-grade toxicity. This is the information about how people are going to live their lives. Not only do we need information about low-grade toxicities, but we need information on what's going to happen over time as far as we understand it. So patient-reported outcomes has come up before in different conversations. These things are being increasingly added into clinical trials, but not regularly and not with a uniform way today. There are so many things people are asking for to be included in how you look at the different treatment options and judge them, i.e. a value framework. We can't add those things in because they're not being captured regularly in the clinical trials.
Yeah. I mean, the cost and access piece is obviously very important, but if somebody like myself can't have a job because of, one of those pieces, it's
a huge component.
Big deals.
Absolutely.
Emily, could you just touch a little bit on, we talked about off-label use yesterday when we were talking on the phone. Can you talk a little bit about your story, once you started with Dr. Fishbane?
Right. So the PARP inhibitor, was incredibly successful. Everyone, we were all shocked by that outcome. So when my cancer returned on my peritoneum, we first thought, I want to try the PARP inhibitor again. But my at that point, I couldn't be on Dr. Pishvine's trial because I had already left it. And my insurance company denied it, denied paying for the PARP inhibitor because they said it was off-label. The PARP inhibitor had been approved for ovarian cancer, but not for pancreatic cancer. So we appealed and they still denied. And this was a very stressful period because you do sort of feel like the clock is ticking and, even though, you feel like your tumors are growing and every day counts. So to go through that appeal process, and then finally we had to go to a drug company and go through their process of getting approval for the drug. In the end, the drug didn't work a second time. But I couldn't imagine not having to at least try the drug, because in my mind, that drug had been incredibly successful the first time. And I couldn't imagine them denying it, to not be able to, just because it was off-label.
Yeah. So maybe, Randy, you can help me with this. Sometimes it seems as if, and I don't want to speak for the payers, but from a patient's perspective or a patient advocate's perspective, that in terms of innovation and access, sometimes we're almost moving in opposite directions. I don't know if you can touch on, what your thoughts are around that and, what we could potentially do about it.
Sure. Well, I just want to jump off of what you both were saying, that I think our healthcare financing and delivery needs to keep pace with innovation. So in some ways, our benefit designs need to catch up with how care has changed, but certainly cancer care has changed dramatically over the past couple of decades. So again, I think updating insurance design so that it is more reflective of where we are at in cancer care right now is one thing we can do, but we have to do that in ways that are cognizant of value at the end of the day at the same time. And Dana, I just think what you, really what you guys both said just underscores so strongly the importance of recognizing that that is complicated, it's nuanced, and it has to be centered and begin with that individual patient. How do we do value in ways that really are truly patient-centered? And I think one thing that Dana talked about, the ability to customize, and as you bring information to the patient, help equip doctors, don't impose on the physician to solve your problem, but equip them so that they can solve the patient's problem. And I think if we get this right, we can get to that kind of a model. How do we bring the evidence together? Not only, as you were saying, from RCTs, this is, if we're going to address issues like, does it matter to a musician whether they have neuropathy or not, that's going to take a broader body of evidence. How do we bring that evidence together, make sure it's reasonably rigorous? How do we help patients understand as best they can, working with their doctor, again, what does that evidence base mean for them as an individual? And how do we give them the tools, but also the time in payment and delivery to customize that, to make the treatment decision that is highest value for them, but ultimately will be high value for the healthcare system overall over the long term? I feel like we have to start there. I think ASCO has made a really important start, and they did it right in reaching out to stakeholders across the system. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a lot more work continuing that needs to be done. We at PhRMA take that seriously. I would say we're going to be making some pretty significant announcements over the next month or two that we hope demonstrates we aren't just saying this, we're committed to actually supporting moving in this direction. Yes, that makes us more accountable for the value of our treatments at the end of the day, but we do fundamentally understand we are a science-driven sector, and we are working to bring to patients treatments that make their lives better, that add value, and that if we get the tools and we get the incentives right, that's going to be a future that's sustainable for patients, for the system, and for innovation at the same time. I think then, and I will have to get one little note in on the Part B demo since you gave me the opportunity, but I think it also illustrates that the kinds of nuance and differences, how would Keytruda for peritoneal tumors, how would that rank on any value scale? Well, A, probably not so hot on some of them, but that doesn't mean it isn't really, really valuable for Emily. That we need to build that into the system, and if we don't, we aren't really doing value. At the end of the day, we're doing cost containment.
Right.
So we need to put our money where our mouth is on value, and we all need to do it, I would say. But to get to the Part B thing, I think it underscores the risk that if we push, the further you push that equation into national policy, the greater the risk that you will not capture value, that you will lose value to the individual patient, and you will end up with a one-size-fits-all average that says, Keytruda for this off-label indication doesn't make the cut, so you aren't going to have access to that, and we need to do better than that. I think that was our fundamental concern with the Part B drug payment model that CMS announced in March. We're waiting, it was not only us, but ASCO and many other scientific clinical specialty societies, patient organizations expressed concerns with that. We're waiting to see how CMS responds to that, but hopefully they'll make some pretty significant adjustments, or even what we'd really like them to do is withdraw it, reset, bring us all around the table and talk about how do we get there together.
Dana?
So I think one important point is that we're all in this together. And, oncologists can only do the best for their patients when they have the best tools to work with. And patients and oncologists together are so dependent on innovation and the pharmaceutical and biotechnology innovations that industry has been able to bring. And truly, as we were talking about from a federal standpoint, the funding levels, if they're not going to grow more, we're only going to see so much come out of the federally funded research. We need more research from a federally funded standpoint, and we need to completely depend on one another to make the best use of the research dollars that we have. One of the things that many of you probably realize is that the numbers, depending on the study, can vary a little bit, but only about 3% of individuals actually go on a clinical trial from a standpoint of cancer, and that's not a whole lot different than the diseases at large in aggregate. We are only learning from those people. A Keytruda, just to sort of clarify, would actually score very well from a benefit standpoint, but we better also take advantage and learn from Emily's story and make that information captured so that we can have data to reproduce and have more people benefit like Emily. So a couple points there. One is get these kind of things studied so that we can actually learn from patients like Emily and her wonderful outcome right now, and hopefully many, many years to come.
Yes.
And also make sure we get more people in the hopper so that we can learn from the gestalt of people. Off-label's funny, it's difficult in some ways, but it can be solved with some of those benefit design reforms we've talked about by creating, I'm a big fan of coverage with evidence development. There are ways to handle things so you can learn from every patient experience. So, I'll also just say, I think that every stakeholder around the table can do something to improve value. This is something, we're all in this together. We all are depending on each other, and we all have a piece to bring. From the physician standpoint and the healthcare provider standpoint, we can practice good medicine, evidence-based medicine, and we cannot be wasteful, and we can do things like the Choosing Wisely campaign, which has gotten national attention for doing things that are known to be helpful and not harmful to patients because they're over-testing and overusing. Patients can be good consumers and educated consumers and try to ask questions. Is this evidence-based? Should I get this? And question also. And also just to make sure that they be their own advocates. So important. Payers have a real responsibility to interpret that evidence in the highest degree as well and be responsible to it in the way they provide their payment policies. And I would say industry has the responsibility, and I know has been working very hard to ensure that what they bring to market can reflect good value. And so we all have a part to play.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. I don't want to beat up on the payers too much because they're not sitting at this table, but
Yeah.
maybe Randy, you can talk a little bit about what you think pharma and the industry is doing to help potentially reduce the cost and time for bringing a drug to market. And then, John, do we have time for like 5 minutes of questions, or do you want to? Okay. Great. I know it's a hard question.
They're all hard questions. Hey, that's why we're here, right? But I'll just pick up again where Dana left off, which is we're all in this together.
Yeah.
That includes the payer. Someone's got to pay the bill at the end of the day, and we appreciate they have a job to play as well. So Do we think there's room for improvement on that side? And I already highlighted benefit design and the fact that there is disproportionately, in many plans, disproportionately high cost sharing for a drug treatment versus something you'd be admitted in a hospital for a surgery or a radiation therapy for that cancer. Lower percentage copay doesn't necessarily reflect a value-based design. So is there room for improvement? Yeah. Are we looking for ways that we can work more closely with payers on solutions that meet their needs, but that are sensitive to the need for continued incentives for innovation and the different needs of patients? That's absolutely we are. So just one area, and it goes back to your original question about how do we communicate about value. One thing we've heard from the payers is that it would be helpful for them to have more advanced warning. Sort of a horizon scanning of new treatments. It would be helpful to them if they didn't have to come and ask a manufacturer every time they wanted evidence for a treatment that doesn't fall cleanly and clearly within the four corners of the labeled indication, which, hey, in cancer these days can be a lot of the information that's out there. So we're working with payers, with clinicians, with other groups to say, how can we bring current regulatory regime into the 21st century in regards to communicating? We're in a system that the incentives are increasingly driving to value. The regulatory system doesn't quite reflect that yet in terms of enabling manufacturers, particularly manufacturers of products, to proactively communicate scientifically rigorous information about that value. So, FDA, to their credit, put out a notice on this a few weeks ago to say we're going to hold a forum in November. We're going to keep a docket open to January to address this issue. We think that was a really important step on the agency's part. We appreciate that. We'll certainly be participating fully in that. But aside from that, continuing to work with payers on other things we can do, other ways we can clarify rules so that we can better give those payers early warning of some of the game changers that are coming down the pike in terms of their potential clinical role, clinical impact, economic impact, and then how can we structure a system so that we are appropriately communicating valid scientific evidence to healthcare professionals, even on approved medicines, as we, and we're going to be harnessing more and more real-world evidence that's going to be telling us more and more on a much more rapid cycle. And hopefully, again, ASCO is doing some good work here. We will be turning that into a feedback loop where we are actually applying that learning.
Right.
That's going to require some new FDA rules for us.
That's great, Randy. Thank you. So are there any questions before we wrap up and John and Governor Dean can get on with their conversation? Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.